Okay guys, so this is just a short video introduction to the source analysis that you have to do as part of your NEA on African American civil rights, so for your coursework, okay? So I'm just going to go through kind of the mark scheme, what you're expected to do for source analysis in your NEA, and then also just show you a few examples of some top source analysis from students in previous years, just to give you an idea about what the final product might look like. Now, the first thing just to note, guys, is that you are given a mark out of 40 for your coursework overall. Now, it's divided up into AO1, AO2, and AO3. The AO1 is essentially for kind of like your overall analysis and just kind of like your essay effectively. So, you know, the historical thinking, your like ability to create a sustained argument, the level of knowledge, your communication. That's half the marks for the assessment. Now, the other 20, though, half the marks, are given for your source analysis and then also for your work on historical interpretations. So even though, as we're going to see in a minute, you only have to analyze and evaluate 3 sources, even to get the top marks, it's worth 10 marks. And one classic mistake that students make with this coursework every year, no matter what we tell them, is they undercook the source work and it really holds them back. Because if you can imagine, if you've done like a really cracking essay and you've got the 16, 17 out of 20 for AO1, if you end up getting 4 out of 10 for your source analysis, which is only for analysing 3 sources, in terms of like the amount of marks you could have gotten for the effort, that would be really poor. So it's really important to get the source analysis right, because it's worth a quarter of the marks for the coursework, and it's only ultimately has to be three sources. Now, just one quick thing. I know I probably bang on about this a lot, but the difference between interpretations and sources. Okay, so we're just going to be talking about the sources, the AO2 part today. Now, remember, in history, there is a big difference between interpretations and sources. Okay, sources are trace elements of the past that historians use to construct an account of what actually happened. So they're the raw material that history is built on. Without sources, history wouldn't exist. Okay, and you know, the leftovers of the past can be all kinds of things. There's all different types of sources, and the point is, the reason why historians debate and argue is because you can look at a set of sources and have a different interpretation of them, but the actual raw material of history is your sources. So, you know, and different types of sources will have different strengths and weaknesses, but they are the fundamental basis of all history writing. So you've got here, for example, you can have like newspapers. You've got here, this is a letter from W.E.B. Du Bois to the War Department praising the integration of African American soldiers in World War One. You've got here I.W. Wells' book. You've got a nice state of Alabama governor, my mind's gone blank there. Sorry, George Wallace, who was a very famous segregationist in the 60s. His address to the citizens of Alabama, a very good example of a speech supporting white resistance, if you're doing that question, or looking at, say, a speech by Booker T. Washington. So these are all examples of kind of different types of sources that an historian writing about civil rights might draw upon. An interpretation is the historian's like version of what they think happened in the past. But the point is that the reason why when you go to the back of a history book, it's always full of footnotes like this, is the idea is that you can't just make claims or an interpretation without evidence. Okay, so writing a history book is not about just writing any old thing that comes to the top of your head. You're expected to have an evidence base for your interpretations and your claims. And the point about footnotes is that it means that other historians, when they're reading your book, if they want to see where you've gotten a particular idea or where a source is from, they can flick to the back of the book and see where you've gotten that from. Word of caution, it's useful to use the footnotes in a historian's book to find primary sources sometimes, but don't forget that sometimes they will also reference the work of other historians. So don't confuse the fact that they will footnote both primary sources, but then also interpretations by other historians. So if you look on this one, for example, you've got a direct speech by W.E.B. Du Bois to black leaders on June the 13th, 1905, the Declaration of Principles. So again, you could look up that speech and where it was from. But then you've also got, for example, other historians' work like Charles W. Dabney, Universal Education in the South, Volume 2. So just keep in mind that footnotes can be useful for finding primary sources, but you'll also find them intermixed with the work of other historians. Okay, so first quick thing, as I mentioned before, how many sources are you expected to incorporate in your NEA? Now, you're only expected to have a minimum of 3. Okay, so you can do more if you want to. A lot of like the best students sometimes end up writing about more, maybe 4 or 5. But you can get full marks writing about just 3 sources if you analyze them well. But 3 is the minimum. And another really important fact, there needs to be of at least 2 different types. Okay, so that's about the nature of the source. So you couldn't have 3 speeches, for example. Yeah, you'd have to have a variety of different types. You might have a newspaper article for one, you might have a poster for another one, you might have a diary for another one. So you've got to make sure there's at least 2 different types of sources over the course of your NEA. Now, they're very, very strict about the fact that if you don't meet those 2 criteria, the highest mark you can get for AO2 is 3 out of 10. So if you, for example, had 3 sources, but they were only of one type, sorry, max 3 out of 10. And then likewise, if you had 2 different types of sources, but there were only 2 sources in total, that would also only be 3 out of 10. Okay, so really important, you need to have 3 sources in total, and then those need to be of a minimum of at least 2 different types. So it could be 2 speeches and a poster, for example, that would be fine, but really, really important to not forget that, year 13. Now, I'm just going to go through the mark scheme very briefly because I think it's easier to understand what they're getting at if you see examples of good work rather than just reading it abstractly, but just to give you an idea of kind of how you're marked. So there's a difference between a level 5 and a level 3. Okay, once you get below level 3, you're talking about ones where they just don't have enough sources, there aren't enough types. So this is kind of a mid-level bit of source analysis. This is the top level. So what they're looking for at the top level is that you provide a range of relevant and well-supported comments on the value of sources. So you're going to be giving, remember, a range. So that means quite a few. So you're not just saying 1 or 2 things about what makes the source useful or limit it in some ways. 3 sources of 2 more different types we've already talked about. The other thing is you've got to have a balanced and convincing judgment on the merits of the source in relation to the topic under investigation. Now, a few things to pick out there. A balanced and convincing judgment means that you're assessing both the strengths and limitations of a particular source. So even if you are really emphasizing the value of a particular source to finding out about a certain issue that's relevant to your question, you need to make sure that you have balance in there. Okay, so make sure that you have comments on both the strengths and the limitations of the source, even if you're leaning very strongly towards, say, strengths. Another key thing to note there is that balanced and convincing judgment on their merits in relation to the topic under investigation. Now, what they mean by that is you're not just saying, oh, this source is useful in general, right? Just weighing up the strengths and weaknesses. Oh, this is this is from a newspaper at the time. Newspapers are useful because they give us an idea about public opinion at the time. Okay, that will get you like a few marks. That will be more like level 3. You've got to think carefully about how useful is that source in relation to the specific question that you're trying to answer. So if you were doing a question about white resistance, for example, why is this particular source that you're analysing particularly useful or not to answering that question? Okay, so you've got to link back the usefulness of the source to the very specific question that you're answering. Yeah, very important. Don't just analyse the strengths and weaknesses of the source in a completely generic way. Link it back to the idea about how that makes it useful for thinking about your particular question. Yeah, mainly focus on strengths. Yeah, because if you're picking out a source to kind of illustrate a certain point, I would say that normally you're going to be focusing mainly on the usefulness of a source. That's why you've included it in your essay. But just make sure that you show the limitations as well in relation to what you're answering. Now, the other side of it, just in terms of what a 5 or 6 out of 10 would look like, and I'll show you an example of what this looks like in a minute. So you provide some relevant comments on the value of your sources. So again, difference with level 5, there's not a range of well-supported ones. So you're giving relevant comments, yeah, so they're not wrong about the value of the sources, but maybe they're a bit underdeveloped, or maybe there's not enough of them. There's not a range, and there's not a depth either. Again, you got to meet the minimum criteria of 3 sources of 2 different types. This one is important though. So some of the commentary is on the sources is, however, of limited scope, not fully convincing, or is only limited relation to the topic under investigation. So again, you might, in the case of that one, be weighing up the strengths and limitations of a source in a very generic way, but you're not linking it back to, okay, why does this make it useful or not to the particular question I'm trying to answer. Yeah. And when it says not fully convincing, what they mean by that is your comments are like a bit vague, or like not really, they don't really make sense, or they're not actually like that convincing in relationships to the particular source that you're looking at. Okay. They then further elaborate in the mark scheme. Again, what kind of things are they looking for? So in commenting and making judgments on the value of the sources, students will be expected to apply their own contextual knowledge. So that's really important. So you've got to use your knowledge of the context to explain the value or not of a source, and to put it in some kind of historical context. I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. So that's the first key thing, contextual knowledge, making use of that like you would normally with source analysis. So we're expected to apply their own contextual knowledge and perspectives of time and place in order to assess the value and limitations of the sources as evidence. Yeah, so using your contextual knowledge. They would be expected to comment on as appropriate to the investigation and chosen sources. Yeah. So remember, what all this comment means is they're saying that you don't need to comment on every single one of these things, but you would be expected to comment on some of them. But it would obviously depend on what particular source you were analysing at that point, what your question was. But these are the kind of things that you could be analysing when you're considering the strengths and weaknesses of a particular source. So you could focus on the differing perspectives of the sources chosen. So, what point of view is this source promoting? That maybe that contrasts with a different source you've looked at, or contrasts with a different point that you've been making. Really important, the social, political, intellectual, religious and or economic context in which the sources were written. That is really, if we're thinking about our classic nature, origin, purpose, we're thinking there about both the origin and the purpose. Okay, so when was that source produced? What was the purpose of the person making it? Why does that make it useful or not for what we're trying to find out here? Yeah, so that's all that's really getting at, the origin and the purpose of the source. Then you've got the credibility, authority, authenticity, consistency, and comprehensiveness of the sources. So again, a few things there. Credibility, authority, authenticity, that is again looking at, to what extent is, say, the source propaganda, to what extent is the author of the source credible, what kind of authority do they have to, illustrate a certain point you're trying to make. The comprehensiveness of the source is basically trying to get into the idea about, do they give you a sort of complete picture of that particular issue, or are they quite narrow in some way? I'll show you an example of what they mean by that in a moment. And then finally, the bias, distortion or propagandistic elements found in the sources. So that's pretty straightforward. You're meant to be able to read sources critically to detect signs of bias or use of propaganda. But very importantly, I always say this, don't say because a source is biased it's not useful. Sometimes the most useful sources in history are in fact very, very biased ones. Okay, so if you were, for example, doing a question on white resistance, okay, and its role in holding back African American rights in history, we just zoom back for a minute. Okay, this address by George Wallace to the people of Alabama is incredibly propagandistic and biased. Okay, he is a politician speaking to his voters, so we know already that he's going to be playing to their prejudices. He's not going to be necessarily saying exactly what he thinks. He's going to be trying to win political points for himself. It's an incredibly biased source, but if we're trying to understand the nature of white resistance, in this case the role of state government and state governors in resisting civil rights, it's an incredibly valuable source. Okay, so make sure to comment on the bias and propagandistic elements where they exist. You can show that you understand and recognize them, but don't make the mistake of saying, well, that means it's not useful. Yeah, you have to be aware of the biases of certain authors, but you don't need to, but you do not go from that to just saying it's biased, it's not useful. Yeah, that is a very low level comment, and you won't be getting into level 4 and 5 with that kind of source analysis. Just one last thing on this as well before we look at some examples. If you're just really thinking about what kind of things are you writing about these sources, it's very similar to the kind of things you get marked on for your source analysis in the democracy and Nazism paper. Okay, so think back to just the mark scheme, what you have to do for that. It's the same type of analysis that you're really doing with these sources. Okay, they want you to draw upon the skills you develop from that paper to do the source analysis in this one. Likewise, some of the skills that you've developed from the Stewart's paper for doing interpretations will help you with the AO3, but we'll look at that in a different video. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some 3 examples now of some source analysis by different students doing different questions I'm just going to read through them and just highlight what kind of makes them good answers. Okay, so in each case, each of these students did 3 sources, 4 sources, and 4 sources respectively. And I'm just going to sort of highlight a couple of things that make it good and also show you the range of the different types of sources that you can use. Okay, so this first one, which I think came from Saqib a couple of years ago. So the first thing to note is that this source is a poster. Saqib's other sources were, I believe, a letter and a speech for his other 2. But this one was a poster. Now, one thing I would also say about this one, guys, is he's written quite a lot here. I wouldn't say you have to write this much in your source analysis. You know, maybe a couple of paragraphs maximum. He's probably overwritten slightly here, but he didn't go over the overall word count, so it didn't hold him back. But just be aware that there might come a point where you have to be economical with your words. Okay, so let's just read through it, and just for context as well, Saqib's essay was on the role of white resistance in restricting African American civil rights, and in this particular section, beforehand in his argument, he's talking about the way that Reconstruction was undermined by white resistance and how that led to the creation of the segregation and the imposition of redemption after 1879. So he's using this source as an illustration to talk about how the Reconstruction period was undermined by white resistance in the American South, and he's using this poster as an example of that. So we've got such degrading examples of white resistance to African American civil liberties can be expressed in the image below, a poster issued in several US political prints in 1866 to oppose the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an agency dedicated to providing amenities and social services to help newly emancipated slaves. Now, I've highlighted that first bit in red just because that shows good contextual knowledge. Yeah? He's using his knowledge of the context to analyse this source and the role that it's playing by showing his knowledge about what the Freedmen's Bureau was in the American South after the Civil War. This makes the source very useful for studying the effects of white resistance, as it showcases race restriction as an accepted political agenda, while its overt biases showcases the message's popularity among citizens. So he's already beginning to comment on the value of it. Okay, so it showcases how race restrictions was an accepted political agenda because it was a public poster, and then the fact that it's actually biased showcases just how popular that message must have been in the American South. So he's already beginning to make some interesting comments on the value of it. Why are you showing me this source about white resistance? He's beginning to build up some comments about why he's chosen this one. So he then goes into sort of the actual detailed analysis of the content of the source, like you guys normally would on a source question at A level. It serves as a dangerous form of propaganda whereby it opines for an opposition to black suffrage as it would protect the white man, showcasing how many resisted liberties as they believed the intermixing of races could damage white pre-established norms. Okay, so he's already picked out one detail and then sort of said, well, what does that show us about what the producers of this poster were trying to do? He's commenting on the value of it. This is also seen in the writing on the poster's left side where the Bible is quoted. This miscasting of religious scripture is done to fit a perverted ideology of engaging all whites, many of whom would have been religious, in the right fight to protect themselves against destruction. Furthermore, the use of God in this situation would indicate that the fight against civil rights for blacks is religiously desired. So again, really, really interesting, showing how it highlights how white resistance to the South was partly driven by religious ideas, that they tried to draw upon biblical justification to undermine the Freedmen's Bureau. So again, that's a very, very useful comment on something that source teaches us about white resistance at that time. This poster is also racially charged in terms of the monetary figures provided on its right-hand side, whereby it shows a deliberate attempt to corral divisions between the races by highlighting a sizable difference and apparent favouring of newly formed black troops, harking at the poster's title of impending white destruction. Okay, so again, very good, useful comment on what these particular numbers reveal to us about how it's stoking division. Right. The division of blacks is furthered in much of the illustration provided, as it depicts an overbearing, idle black man who is seen indulging at the expense of the hard-working white man. So again, he's describing what the source is actually showing us, but then he's explaining the value of it. Okay, so what does that show us about white resistance? So you can see here the caricatured African-American and the white man over here working very hard. The illustration would indicate the aforementioned theme of tribalism, with many whites believing civil liberties to blacks infringe on the rightful land they built. Furthermore, the stereotypical portrayal of the black man, complete with exaggerated facial features and raggedy clothing, is designed to showcase they would provide no value to the country as freedmen. Why would they if they could not even bother to remove themselves from slave clothing? So again, he's just very, very intelligently analysed the value of this source in terms of what it reveals to us about the nature of white resistance, the sort of motivations for it, and kind of analysed the particular context in which this poster came about. So again, that's a very, very good bit of source analysis. Okay, now the second one is from Stevie last year, no, 2 years ago. And what she's doing here is analysing the Atlanta Compromise speech by Booker T. Washington. So I've not put that in here, but that one you should be familiar with by now from your reading. You can Google it if you don't know it. She quotes a very short excerpt from the speech, like a sort of half a paragraph, and then she kind of analyses that in quite some detail afterwards. Now, for a little bit of context, Stevie was doing an essay on the role of African American leadership in promoting civil rights a lot, and in the preceding section, she's talking about the differences that emerge between accommodationists like Washington and then assimilationists like W.E.B. Du Bois, and she's using Washington's speech to illustrate the point about why the tactics that leaders chose had a big impact. Okay, so she's using that. She's using the speech to essentially illustrate the importance of leaders' views, and particularly the views of Washington in the case of the accommodationists. Okay, so above is an excerpt from the Atlanta Compromise given in Atlanta in 1895, and I believe there is no other speech which represents the nature of Washington's strategy so well. She's immediately commented on why is this source being included, because it's going to illustrate what Washington's strategy as a black leader was for achieving African American rights. In this speech, it is profoundly clear that his aim is to both appease and foster the bond with the South, while simultaneously propelling developments forward. The language is very conservative and pandering, showing an awareness of his audience, who are predominantly white Southern politicians, and therefore far more racist in their views. So she is thinking very carefully here about the political and religious context in which this source was produced. Okay, so this is Washington speaking to an audience of white conservatives, trying to win them over to a kind of accommodationist, separatist, system that Washington was promoting at the time. Washington comments that in no way had the value and manhood of the American Negro been more fittingly and generously recognised. So she's sort of pulling out a bit of her speech. She's then going to sort of criticise what Washington's saying by putting in her knowledge of the historical context. In 1865, Jim Crow laws had been introduced within the last decade, and the 1890s was the worst decade in terms of lynching. From 1887 to 1892, 9 states, including Louisiana, passed laws requiring separation, and again she's quoted from historians here. As a result, the period from 1890 to 1920 is often called the nadir meaning lowest point of African American history. Therefore, by showing gratitude to the very men who implemented these laws and supported white supremacy, Washington created a number of enemies within the movement. So she's showing that she understands the context of this speech, both in terms of the context in which Washington is making the speech, but then also the wider historical context, and then being able to link that to, okay, so why did this speech lead to such big divisions in the African American freedom movement at the time? So this speech in particular led to a very controversial response and was indirectly linked to the formation of the NAACP and groups that favoured methods of direct agitation. So you could argue that's actually more like red, that's more knowledge of the context to comment on the value of it. Although perhaps Washington's more cautious approach was a direct result of the fearful and discriminatory atmosphere which hindered his capabilities. After all, it was far easier to live as an African American in the North than it was in the South. Despite the location, it is undeniable that without widespread support, a leader of a movement has little room to manoeuvre. So she's thinking about the context here in terms of like where Washington lived compared to a lot of the other elite Northern African American leaders at the time, and how that affected his room for manoeuvre, like what the things he was saying and the kind of strategies that he adopted. Therefore, the tactics of the leader are critical, as this will determine the extent of the support they would receive and who the support would be from. For instance, the people in the South could not display their support as explicitly due to a more volatile position. So again, she's thinking here about what this source can teach us about how the tactics that black leaders adopt will depend upon their context and their location and their situation, okay? And she's using the kind of content of the speech to illustrate that idea. The polarization of sport created a fragmented campaign and deepened the tensions that existed from the start due to disagreements over methods and goals. Accommodationism was perceived by some as too moderate, whereas assimilation also had its fair share of opprobrium, faulted for being too violent and extreme, creating a massive divide among supporters. So she just used that speech to basically then comment on, well, what does that show us about what's the value of this source? It shows us the importance of like leaders' views, ideas, how they're shaped by their time and context, etc. So a lot of really great knowledge of the context and comments on the value there. All right, a third and final example is another poster. Okay, and this comes from Charlie from a couple of years ago. And again, for context with this one, Charlie was writing an essay on white resistance. Okay, so the role of white resistance in restricting African American rights. In this section, he is looking in the paragraphs prior. His overall argument is focusing on this idea about how lynching was part of this kind of strategy of white violence that emerged following Reconstruction to keep African Americans in their place and reverse the gains of Reconstruction. So it's kind of like a source to illustrate the wider points Charlie is making either side of the source about the role of lynching and white violence in restricting African American civil rights. So first of all, produced in 1890, this image acts to legitimize lynching as a replacement for conventional justice, and it also acts to assert white domination. So again, we've got a comment straight away about why we're looking at this source. What's the point? It's going to show us how lynching was legitimized and the way that lynching was used to replace conventional, like, court-based justice. The caption in particular, stamped to death by a circus hand, a Negro boy at Norfolk, VA, killed for crawling under a circus tent, is a blatant attempt to legitimize lynching. So again, just like when you're doing normal source analysis, picking out details from the source, explaining why those details are useful or not. This is because the phrasing "for" implies that there is a valid reason that the boy was lynched by the circus hand. The image itself has a similar effect, for none of the audience attempts to prevent the murder, instead looking on in distress. So again, that's quite useful because, okay, so he's commenting on the fact that the actual just phrasing on the bottom of the poster sort of shows that they are kind of like legitimizing the murder that's taking place, and the fact that no one in the background looks that shocked, they're not intervening. That just that wording and that sort of context sort of makes lynching somewhat normalized in the case of this. And then so that's about the actual content of the source, but then goes on to comment on the origin of it. So again, this is more about the context again. The origin of the source adds further clarity to its true intentions. The fact that it is from the National Police Gazette, a male-targeted magazine concerned with police matters across America, with an explicit justification for murder, reflects that the police acted with strong racial bias against black people. So again, thinking about who the magazine is, it can tell us quite a lot about what the intentions of the author are. So again, it's thinking about the origins and the purpose behind this source. And again, to justify this point that he's making here, that at the time there was a strong racial bias by American police against black people, he uses his knowledge of the context at the time. This was shown in the lynching of Henry Smith just 3 years after the publication of the issue of the National Police Gazette, where 10,000 people watched Henry Smith's torture and murder, with parts of his body sold as souvenirs with no police intervention, showing very clearly that the police in the South held such contempt for black people that they would not give them the protections that their status as citizens should have afforded them. So again, he's used his knowledge of the context at that time to kind of like explain and greatly contextualize what the source is saying. Okay, so he's claimed here that it's a magazine for people who are concerned with police matters, and at the time the police were racially biased, and he's used his knowledge of the context to illustrate that point. So then going back to commenting on the value of the source. Now, what's quite good here is that what I like here that the other two don't do quite so much is he much more explicitly comments on some of the limitations of the source. The other two do it with their other sources. That's why they managed to get full or close to full marks. But I really like this bit here where Charlie comments on the limitations of the source. So, however, the usefulness of this source is limited with regards to the study of the extent of physical white resistance, because its origin means that it may not be concerned with the reality of the act, but instead the glorification of it. So he's sort of saying here that the source is in some ways limited by the fact it is from this National Police Gazette magazine, that maybe they are not depicting the reality of what lynching actually looked like, but they're instead trying to sort of glorify it, right? Because you've got this white guy standing up this black guy, etc. And we'll get into that in his analysis now. So this is because its origins means that it may not be concerned with the reality of the act, but instead the glorification of it. The white man is portrayed as towering over the black man and in total control, altering the perception of lynching away from the reality, which is that it was often groups lynching singular victims for arbitrary crimes for which there was no evidence, just as was the case with Henry Smith. So again, he's saying this is potentially a misleading source because it could be misrepresenting the reality of lynching, and he links that fact back to who the source is by, because obviously we know lynching actually normally wouldn't be one white man standing over a black man with his boot on. It would be a very large group of white men pouncing on a single African American and then lynching them. So it's potentially a misleading source. Okay, guys. So I hope that was useful. Again, remember with this video, you can always come back to it and flick through. I will now just upload a very short one as well on how to find some sources. Okay, so how do you actually go about finding sources now that you know how to analyze them? Okay, great.